In this video, we're going to cover the sun and its properties. At the center of all stars, including our sun, we have nuclear fusion that takes place at the center. That nuclear fusion takes the hydrogen and makes it or converts it into helium through fusion process. So it fuses those atoms together. That gives off an enormous amount of energy. When that energy finally reaches the surface of the sun, it makes the surface temperature roughly around 5,780 Kelvin. The radius of the sun is more than 100 times that of the Earth, and it's 300,000 times more massive than the Earth. Here you can see a picture comparison of the sun with the four terrestrial planets and the four Jovian planets. Notice it's much, much, much larger. The sun also has what we call differential rotation. Differential rotation is when it rotates at different rates at the equator than it does at the poles. Differential rotation can also be that it rotates differently with depth. So here's a picture diagram of the differential rotation. If we were to take a sunspot and look at it, its rotation would be much, much further on the equator than as you get towards the poles. Okay, so this is what we call differential rotation. The different areas on the sun do not rotate at the same speed. Okay, so let's talk about the parts of the sun. If we start at the center, we have the core. Surrounding the core is what we call the radiative zone. Outside of that, around that, we have what we call the convective zone. Above the convective zone is what we call the surface, and that's the photosphere. The sunspots appear on the photosphere. Above the photosphere, we have the lower, cooler atmosphere, which we call the chromosphere. The chromosphere goes up, and then it's surrounded, the sun is surrounded by its upper atmosphere, which is called the corona. We can also see flares and also prominences form from the surface of the sun. So in the core, it's the centralmost region of the sun, and this is where the nuclear reactions take place. Again, we're fusing hydrogen to helium. Next is the radiative zone, or in this lecture, it's called the radiation zone. This is the interior of the sun where the radiation leaves the core and moves through this part of the sun uninhibited. So it's really high temperatures. All of the particles in the radiative zone are ionized, and that radiation can move through easily and quickly. It doesn't get absorbed by anything. Okay, so the gas is completely ionized, and the photons travel through this region with relative ease. Next, we have the convective zone. The convective zone is also the interior of the sun. It lies just below the surface, which is the photosphere. The material of the sun is in constant convective motion. So as those gases that make up the outer part of the sun, as they're exposed to the radiation from the radiative zone, they're going to heat up. As it heats up, it's going to rise. Once it gets close to the surface, which is cooler, it releases that radiation or that energy, and it gets cooled off, and then it's going to sink back down again. This region extends about 200,000 kilometers from the photosphere inward. The photosphere is where that electromagnetic radiation from the center can escape. This is also the part of the sun that we see when we look up in the sky. The chromosphere is actually the lower, cooler atmosphere of the sun. It doesn't give off light of its own like the photosphere does. It's also a low-density gas. So if we were to actually look at the gas above the surface, we would actually see an absorption spectrum for the chromosphere. The corona is seen during a total solar eclipse. It is the hot, low-density upper atmosphere of the sun. There is a rapid temperature change between the corona and the chromosphere. So the chromosphere is one temperature, and then we see a huge, drastic increase in temperature as we reach for the corona. The corona has to have some type of energy source. Where's that energy coming from? How is it heating up so much? We believe that it's probably due to the magnetic disturbances that are on the photosphere. As there's more and more magnetic disturbances, we believe that that energy is what's causing that corona to heat up. That heating up area, it happens very, very quickly, and we call that the transition zone. It's what separates the chromosphere and the corona. So here you can see in the diagram that as we move upward from the photosphere, we get to about maybe 5,000 kilometers above the surface, and that kind of seems to be the lowest temperature. It slowly increases until we get to about 2,200 kilometers above the surface, and it heats up there to about 10,000 Kelvin. Notice the transition zone. The transition zone occurs right here. Right here. So you can see that the temperature increases from about 10,000 Kelvin up to almost 1,000,000 Kelvin in a very short period. The solar winds are what leaves the corona, and this is the material that actually bombards satellites and hits our planet. So the solar material that escapes into space is called the solar wind. It flows outward throughout our solar system, and it gives the internal parts of the solar system a temperature of about 10 Kelvin. These are fast-moving particles. They're going to be protons and also electrons. On the surface, we have something called granulation. Granulation is a mottled appearance, and it's caused by those convective cells we were talking about that are just below the photosphere. They're probably about 1,000 kilometers across. They last about 5 or 10 minutes before they shift positions. So here you can see in the diagram that we have the heated gas rising up. It cools as it gets close to the surface, and then it starts sinking down again. And these cells move as the gases are heated up and cooled. Spicules are another feature that we see on the surface of the sun. They're needle-like filamentary structures that come up from the photosphere. This material is rising and falling about 100 kilometers per second. They can reach heights of about 5,000 to 20,000 kilometers. And they can actually reach up into the chromosphere. Lots of us have heard about sunspots. Sunspots usually act in pairs, so we usually see 2 or more together. They usually last between 1 and 100 days, each sunspot. They're also periodic in nature, which means that we can see a large number of sunspots on the surface of the sun, and then we won't see any at all, and then we'll see another large number of sunspots again. That periodic cycle is between 11 and 13 years. Notice I say between 11 and 13, it can be 9, it can be 15, it could be 12, it could be 8. But on average, it usually ranges between 11 and 13. The sunspot consists of 2 parts. The inner part, which is the darkest part, is called the umbra. The outer part, which is light in color, is called the penumbra. Here you can see the umbra right here and the penumbra, which is right here. Here you can see a model of the magnetic fields that we believe produce these sunspots. Here's another diagram which also shows you the size of a sunspot with respect to the Earth. Okay, prominences are loops or sheets of glowing gas that are ejected from an active region on the solar surface. They move through the inner parts of the corona under the influence of the sun's magnetic field. There's two different types of prominences. The first that we're going to talk about is called the quiescent prominence. This can actually persist for days or even weeks. The next one is called active prominences. These are much more erratic. They can come and go much more quickly, and they can change their appearance in a matter of hours. They surge up from the photosphere and then immediately fall back down on themselves. Here's a picture of a prominence. We would call this one a quiescent prominence. And here you can also see a quiescent prominence, and then you can also see sheets being thrown up from the surface. Notice that this is in the far UV image range, so that tells us that these are extremely high energy right here. And that's the website that I found the pictures at. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is flares, and this is the last item. A flare is in the low sun's atmosphere, and this occurs near those active regions. The active regions are magnetic fields. When those magnetic fields get twisted up, it produces an enormous amount of energy. Think of it as taking a rubber band and continuing to twist it over and over again. If we were to keep one end on our finger and attach the other to like a top or something like that, or a thimble, it would actually spin very, very fast. Okay? Same thing with these magnetic fields. When they get all tangled up, there's an enormous amount of energy that's stored. And in that energy, we produce these flares when they actually start to snap. So they're a result of those magnetic instabilities when that magnetic instability snaps. They're going to be much more violent than prominences because of that. These flashes occur and they cross over the region of the sun in a matter of minutes. They release an enormous amount of energy. And that energy, when released, can actually cause what we call coronal mass ejection. And those are enormous solar storms that can actually knock out satellites. Okay, here's a picture of the flare. Okay, so we really need to understand flares, because if they do hit our electronics or our satellites per se, like if it's a huge coronal mass ejection, there have been several that could have wiped out all of our satellites. If one of them were actually to hit our satellites, we could actually be back without cell phones, without any electronics for years. It could be 5 to 10 years before we could get back up and running again. So it's kind of important that we understand the severity of these flares and the coronal mass ejections.